Well, you gather from my name that my father's family are Hindu. My surname is actually the name of a Hindu god. So I was born and grew up in a very pluralistic society with all the major world faiths, excepting Judaism, present in Sri Lanka. And all my life, I've wrestled with some of the questions that Diana raised for us. So these are very important challenges, both on the political as well as the personal level.
Thank you very much.
Thank you to the Veritas Forum for their invitation. It's a great honor, pleasure for me to be with you this evening. I endorse much of what Professor Eck has been saying, and I'm not going to directly respond to her, but just speak to the topic of religious pluralism and tolerance. We don't know what we believe and why, let alone how much our lives match up to what we claim to believe, until we engage in serious dialogue with others, especially those who are profoundly different to us. In other words, the other is indispensable to our own self-discovery. An argument and disagreement, far from showing lack of respect, are actually honoring of others. We are saying that the other's views are important enough for us to engage with them seriously. Not so when we refuse to engage, as when we either demonize others or we say something like, well, they're all saying the same thing anyway, but in different ways. That is a profound lack of respect for people. So often the language of tolerance is used as a way of avoiding the dangerous act of exploring the world of others. We are, in effect, saying, leave me alone. Don't examine and critique my world. And that is essentially what both relativism and the myth of a supposedly neutral secularity both entail. Tolerance also raises important issues about power and control. Who is tolerating whom? Who speaks of the weak and the powerless tolerating the strong, or of minorities tolerating the majority? And even when it comes to interfaith dialogue, we need to ask who gets to sit at the dialogue table. Last year I met a prominent American theologian who was invited to Tehran to participate in a conference of over 2,000 Iranian Shiite clergy. He was the only Christian in this conference. I was so envious of the opportunity that he received. I knew coming from Sri Lanka, I would never be invited. And I asked him, these Shiite clergy who've invited you to speak on, how Christians understand peace and reconciliation, do they ever talk with the Iranian Christian leaders? And he laughed and he said, no, never. They invited me because I'm an American. And they want to have good relations with America, and they think America is a Christian power, so we need to invite an American Christian. So these are some of the myths that we encounter, myths that are prominent not only amongst Muslims, but amongst many Americans, including American Christians. There is a profound ignorance on all sides that we have to struggle to dispel. Most Muslims, indeed most Americans, are not aware that 2/3 of Christians in the world live in the global South, or that the majority of recent immigrants to the US are Christians, at least by name. They're often poor, they're located in inner city areas, and these new urban congregations represent a growing de-Europeanization of American Christianity. Most Americans tend to identify Arab with Muslim. They're shocked to learn that there are more Christians in the Palestinian refugee camps than in the entire state of Israel. As for Christian mission, myths are plentiful. It was freed slaves from Jamaica who carried into the heart of Africa a generation before the first European missionary set foot on African soil. And the fastest growth of the African church occurred in the post-colonial era. It was Muslims in Africa who profited most from colonial rule. As for Asia, the ancient Persian church of the 4th century witnessed more martyrdoms than in the first 300 years of the church of the Western Roman Empire. And the first Christians in China and India emerged centuries before the creation of Europe itself. But perhaps the greatest myths of all revolve around the use of the word religion, spelt with a capital R. Religion, like mysticism and supernatural, these terms reflect linguistic habits first learned in 17th century Europe and shaped by deism. The idea that there is a universal genus, religion, with Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, and so on viewed as subspecies of this genus. It's assumed that there is a common universal religious experience that undergirds these faiths and a common morality that's refracted in different practices. And those scholars, usually European and American, who adopt a theoretical privileged position outside of every specific faith community, try to elaborate a general structure of religious truth that can provide a space for every religious tradition, but which nobody believes in. Lack of commitment under the pretext of openness leads to no real dialogue. We cannot put our faith in parentheses to connect with another's faith. Moreover, the more that we explore the faith traditions and their practices, we discover that they are embedded in worldviews that make conflicting, even incommensurable truth claims. They embody radically different visions of human flourishing. The shalom of the kingdom of God is not the moksha of dominant Hindu schools or Buddhist nirvana. Theoretical attempts to bring them under some overarching, rational meta-narrative end up denying genuine pluralism, of not respecting the otherness of the other. And this is the paradox at the heart of many pluralistic philosophies and theologies of religion. I think it's more intellectually honest to accept these divergent worldviews and social practices and to say that we have to choose which we consider more truthful than others. Exercising hospitality towards unfamiliar and alien ways of thought and life does not absolve us of the responsibility to be critical. Public indifference to truth is no less harmful to a civilization than fanatical insistence on truth. A second reason that I'm uncomfortable with talk about religion in this generic sense is that it occludes from view the way that consumerism, sport, nationalism, capitalism, scientism, for example, function as global religions today. The shopping mall, the health club, the football stadium, the stock exchange, July 4th celebrations, these are great places to study religious behavior. They are the new temples and the sacred icons of the late modern world. They're all surrounded by elaborate liturgies, rituals, the aura of the mysterious. They place a high premium on community and collective loyalty and blind worship. So by treating religion as a separate academic discipline, we may be blinding ourselves to the ways that religion is flourishing among so-called secular people. Thirdly, so much of religion, traditional or modern, is the locus of superstition, gullibility, cruelty, exploitation. And that goes for much of Christianity too in its history, not least the folk Christianity of Christendom. But the assumption that the human-divine encounter takes place primarily in the realm of religious experience or religious communities, this assumption is challenged fundamentally by the heart of the Christian gospel. The earliest Christian profession, what made a man or woman a Christian, was the confession, Jesus is Lord. And Jesus is Lord was never merely a statement of personal devotion. It was an announcement of a decisive event within secular human history that had universal, indeed cosmic implications. The Jesus of whom the first Christians spoke had been crucified by the Roman authorities. And in the Roman Empire, crucifixion, though widespread, was viewed with universal disgust and horror. It was the most humiliating form of execution, the death penalty reserved for rebellious slaves, insurgents against the state, people we'd call terrorists today. No Roman citizen could be crucified. Romans didn't even discuss the subject. They pretended it never existed. It was the way they preserved the Pax Romana. So crucifixion was a way of obliterating not only the victim, but also the memory of him. And that's why not a single ancient historian pays attention to crucifixion. So I cannot overemphasize the absurdity, the foolishness of the Christian proclamation. If you wanted to convert the educated and pious religious people of the empire to your cause, whatever that cause may have been, the worst thing you could ever do would be to link that cause to a recently crucified man in an obscure part of the empire. To put it mildly, that would have been a public relations disaster. And to associate God, the source of life, with this crucified criminal was to invite mockery, ridicule, sheer incomprehension. And that was indeed the experience of the early church. But if this message were true, then surely it subverts the world of religion. It claimed that if you wanted to know what God is like, what are God's purposes for the world, you had to go not to the countless religious temples and sacred groves that dotted the empire, or even to the lofty speculations of the sages and philosophers, but you had to go outside the walls of Jerusalem and gaze in your imagination on that broken, battered, tortured corpse, that is what God is like. For the Jews, a crucified Savior, this was a contradiction in terms. It expressed not God's power, but God's powerlessness. For Greeks, the idea that a God or a son of God should die as a state criminal, that human salvation should depend on that particular historical event, was not only offensive, it was sheer madness. The Roman pantheon was most hospitable. It could readily accommodate any new deity in a manner very similar to that of Hindu Vedanta. The public cult of the emperor was a way of preserving the religious pluralism of the empire. The new Christian movement would have been accorded a ready welcome if it simply took its place as another private cult amongst the myriad of cults that the empire boasted. But the early Christians refused that offer, because for them Jesus was not a deified man, like the emperors at the Senate from time to time decreed to be divine, nor was he a mythological hero like Hercules or Arjuna in the Hindu epics. His labors were real, the agony of a cross outside the walls of Jerusalem. Now, it is the madness of this word of the cross that compels us to take it seriously. And I'm a Christian today because there's something so foolish, so absurd, so counterintuitive, so topsy-turvy about the Christian message that it gets under my skin. It has the ring of truth about it. No one can say that this was some pious invention because it ran counter to all notions of piety. This vision of ultimate reality as self-giving love, a love that suffers with us and for us, and yet is not overcome by suffering. This vision of ultimate reality is not found anywhere in the religious traditions of humankind, or even in the great literatures of humankind. And the church that has been entrusted with this message for the sake of the world is still itself discovering the richness and ramifications of that message through the church's encounter with others, an encounter that is not confined to the realm of the religious or the spiritual, but embraces the economic, the cultural, the political, and every other area of life. The Christian movement is the world's most extensive and longest sustained engagement with human otherness. Wherever the church has been faithful to the gospel, it has recognized the intrinsic worth of peoples and cultures long despised by the dominant religious and political elites. The church has been motivated to serve the so-called dregs of humanity, the destitute, the disabled, the dispossessed. And this is a continuing story of Christian witness in many parts of the world. So far from the message of the incarnation of God in the human person of Jesus of Nazareth breeding any notions of religious or cultural superiority, it actually humbles human pride. Thank you.